Module 1, Lesson 20, An Introduction to Manual Mode. In this lesson you'll learn the basics of manual exposure mode. It's a big enough and important enough topic that I have devoted the whole of Module 5 to it, and a lot of teaching throughout this course is focused on using manual mode. But let's start with an introduction. With your camera set to manual exposure mode, you are in control of the aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings. It is possible to leave the ISO on auto, but I don't recommend this because then the camera is still in control of your exposure. Many people make the assumption that it's too difficult to learn to set your exposure manually. There are a lot of photography books and courses available teaching that you do not need to use manual mode and that it's too complicated and slow. I completely disagree with this teaching. It is a little more difficult and it does take time to learn and practice, but once you have, you'll be unlikely to ever use any of the other auto or semi-auto exposure modes again. In manual exposure mode, you can decide the exact settings for your exposure without having to use compensation and be left guessing how your photos will look. My first camera gave me no option but to learn manual mode. I had no auto or semi-auto exposure modes on that camera. I wish camera manufacturers would still produce simple cameras with only manual mode so there would be fewer distractions for photographers as they learn the essentials of photographing. You'll need to know how to view the information your camera's exposure meter provides. This will tell you when you have the right settings for your exposure. The exposure meter usually looks something like this. Watch the meter as you adjust the aperture and shutter speed settings. Setting a slower shutter speed and a wider aperture using a lower f-stop number lets more light into your camera. The meter will move towards the plus sign. Setting a faster shutter speed or a narrower aperture, a higher f-stop number, allows less light to enter your camera. The meter will move towards the minus sign. When you adjust the aperture and shutter speed settings so the meter is reading 0, you should have a good exposure. Module 1 Photography Course Challenge number 20. For this challenge we will look again at how the three parts of the exposure triangle work together to create an acceptable exposure. Today, choose a fairly evenly lit scene to take your photos. First, set your shutter speed to 1/125th of a second and your aperture to f8. Now adjust your ISO so the exposure meter is reading 0. And take some photos. In the next step, adjust your ISO to double whatever the first setting was. So, if your ISO was at 400, now make it 800 and take some more photos. For the next set of photos, leave your ISO at the same setting and alter your shutter speed to 1/500th of a second and take some more photos. Now, leave your ISO the same, but switch your shutter speed back to 1/125th of a second and your aperture to f4 or as wide as it will go and take some more photos. Take notes about your settings and what you're observing. You will have some well exposed photos and some will be underexposed, others will be overexposed. Learning to use manual exposure controls allows you to choose your exposures. As I mentioned in Lesson 17 when I introduced you to exposure compensation, your camera is smart, but it's not creative. It does not know what you're photographing. Some cameras are programmed to guess at best. Learning to use manual mode and understanding light will give you the most creative flexibility as a photographer. Key points from this lesson are: with your camera set to manual exposure, you're in control of the aperture, shutter speed and ISO settings. Learning to use manual mode is not as difficult as you may think. Manual mode takes time and practice and gives you more creative control.